All right, guys. So I just gave the intro. I just want to give the highlights real quick. When we talk about bureaucracy, go in and read those lecture notes online. Remember that I'm giving the same lecture tomorrow. I'll bring that up into your Moodle as well, so you'll have access to it. But rather than go over the exact same thing and the same 54 minutes of talking about the spoils system and Andrew Jackson and the birth of the Democrat Party and the birth of the Republican Party. Oh man, it was, like I said, there was a lot of information there, and I'm just kicking myself that there's not a better way to check this and be sure. I'm not going to get into it, but technology. So as far as bureaucracy goes, what we were just talking about, again, when it comes to that primary role of the president, which we've already talked about those 6 roles, the CEO or the chief executive officer, that's number 1. And so the president oversees that what we call the bureaucracy, down through the different department heads, through the middle management to that individual at the street level, what we call the street level bureaucrat, who administers policy. As we've talked about in class, bureaucracy has grown because the scope of the federal government, what the federal government has grown as well. I'm not sure the Constitution really had provided for this kind of growth, but it is what it is. We are where we are. We spent quite a bit of time in that last lecture, and just want to touch on it real quick about the spoils period, how we get into the spoils period, and these concepts of patronage and merit. Again, read those lecture notes online. They give an accounting of what we had just lectured over. The main point being that the spoils system, which is ushered in with Andrew Jackson and his common man platform and his concept or promise that government should be for everybody, for the common man and everybody, not just for the somebodies. He was practicing what we call patronage. That is giving government jobs basically as a reward for support. And he didn't create that by any means. In fact, there was patronage before Andrew Jackson. I like to call it blue blood patronage versus common man patronage. The blue blood meaning that you had to be somebody, a blue blood, a somebody, in order to be a part of this national government, this federal government. I mean, it was the closest thing we had to kind of titles after our full system of titled nobility, right, which was forbidden in the federal Constitution for both states and for the federal government. So titles like commissioner and commissions in the military, right, lieutenant, general, colonel. I mean, those were the titles of the day. And if you wanted one of those titles, those positions, you had to basically be somebody. And of course, the unwritten rule was that you would throw your support behind the person who supports you, right? So it's kind of a hand-washing relationship. Jackson runs for president after Monroe. So you basically have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. And remember that Adams was the last of the Federalists, right? Kind of pushed out by these Democrat Republicans and Thomas Jefferson, the anti-Federalists, and Madison, who helped to write the Constitution. You would consider him to be a Federalist. He's Jefferson's Secretary of State. He takes the reins after Jefferson, serves 2 full terms. Then Monroe he's the Secretary of State. He takes the reins from Madison. He becomes president. We get the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, one of the heroes of the War of 1812, the hero of New Orleans. He's running for president, probably the most popular of the candidates running. But there are other individuals who also wish to be president of the United States. And they're all really running under the kind of the Democrat Republican moniker. That's kind of that's the party. If you want to be president of the United States, that's the nomination you need. You get that nomination, you're good to go. There's still multiple parties. I'm just saying that that's the party you want. And so Jackson and John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and an individual named Henry Clay from Kentucky, I believe, are all running for president, as is Andrew Jackson. Yeah, Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun. That's one. Yeah, John C. Calhoun. Now, Jackson and Calhoun, those names should sound fairly familiar. I mean, if you live in Battle Creek, you're in Calhoun County, named after John C. Calhoun. And if you're like me from Jackson, Michigan, the city of Jackson, actually Jackson County, Jackson City, it's where I'm from. That's named after Andrew Jackson at the time. Counties were being listed before we became a state. It was the Jackson administration that was in power at the time. So a number of individuals who were in government at that time, Livingston and Cass and Marshall, as we talked about Marshall, all are namesakes of these different towns and communities as Michigan was getting started. Regardless, Jackson runs and he loses, and not because he's not the most popular of candidates, but he ultimately loses because John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay team up. And even though Calhoun and Jackson team up, the support that they have is not as great as the support that Clay and Quincy Adams have. And that really just irks Andrew Jackson. And in fact, with that, Andrew Jackson, because he doesn't get the party nomination, the next go around 4 years later, he runs with his own political party. The Democrat Party is born. And the Democrat Party's platform, which is necessary for the birth of a party, right? What do you stand for? What do you stand on? What is it that I get by electing you? What does the D next to your name mean? That is the Democrat Party that becomes what we call the common man platform. And there's some, I think, the roots of the Democrat Party are still there today regarding this idea of being the common man for everybody, not just the somebodies, not just the blue bloods, but government should be for everybody. And I think that is consistent even today. When Andrew Jackson does get elected with this new Democrat Party and true to this idea of the common man platform, there's a change in the air of the White House itself and of Washington. And famously, for example, Andrew Jackson puts the big block of community cheese in the White House, and it's open to individuals to walk in. And his inaugural night is so ruckus, they say he got pushed out of his own party out the window of his own party because the crowd had gotten so large. But with Andrew Jackson, we enter into what we call the spoils period or the spoils system. Now, again, it's still patronage, but now it's patronage gone a little bit wild. There's maybe less attention to who the individual is, or even what the individual's qualifications might be for the jobs that are being doled out. Again, with the expectation that those individuals taking those jobs cut monies back to the party at the very least, and in support through the party to the elected individuals of that party. So it's a hand washing relationship, and that spoils period lasts all the way till 1883, as it says in Election Notes Online, as we talked about in that failed lecture. 1883 is where we get what's called the Pendleton Act. It happens after Garfield's assassination. Garfield is assassinated partly, maybe a large part, because he is for reform of the spoils system. If we can back up just a bit, the Republican Party, right, the counter to the Democrat Party, our modern two-party system now, the Democrats and the Republican Party is born in 1854, and it's born over in Jackson, Michigan, which oddly enough, Andrew Jackson, the first of the Democrats, and in his namesake county and city, really, we get the birth of the Republican Party. Other communities will lay claim to that birthplace of the Republican Party, but truly it is Jackson. Again, I know a little bit about that, being from that area and knowing the history of Jackson. And again, just from the political science aspect, you're not a political party until you have something to stand on. You're not a political party until you have candidates to run for office. And all that happens in Jackson. Before that, in Ripon, Wisconsin, you had a group of individuals who came and talked about the need to create a party. No platform, no candidates, no party. Before Ripon, you had Crawfordsville, Iowa. You had Exeter, New Hampshire. Same talk as equal to that happened in Ripon. It's in Jackson where the individuals came together and actually formed the party, created the platform, some 13 planks, 11 of them having to do with the issue of slavery. I mean, the Republican Party really was born out of it. Opposition to slavery, but also opposition to the Democrat Party. You had the Whigs and then the Northern Democrats, the abolitionists and free soilers all coming together to create this new Republican Party. And again, with the intent of ultimately ending slavery, if not certainly curtailing its expansion. You had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which really helps to spur this along, where prior you had states coming in 2 by 2, free state and slave state, to keep that balance. Slavery is a big issue, right? It's a big economic issue. It's a big issue to the South. I mean, it was the reason for the Civil War. It was the reason the South seceded from the Union. But again, in the context of not the issue of the morality of slavery, though that was part of it, certainly for the Republicans, but also the issue of the Constitution and the institution of slavery that wasn't created with the birth of the United States. We do a disservice to ourselves if we attempt to lay blame for the institution of slavery at the feet of the United States. Slavery existed well before the United States and accepted as a practice, loathed, but still accepted as a practice that goes back in our history as human beings. If you read your Old Testament, back to certainly to Pharaoh and the Israelites, but we know that slavery existed prior to the birth of the United States. And so for us to use our 2020 sensibilities and try to get into the heads of accepted and not accepted of the 1860s as we get into the Civil War, that's tough to do. But regardless, the individuals who were opposed to slavery, and rightfully so, were pushing to end it. The Constitution didn't allow them a way to force upon the states across the board a way to get rid of slavery, and so the Civil War ultimately culminated from that. Now, 2 things you should know regarding the South secession: they create their own constitution, right? They don't even though they're the Confederate states, so states prior to the Constitution, the system prior to the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, they're a confederation. Right, hence the Confederate States, but they still have a constitution, and they bind themselves together through this constitution, and they take the tenets of the Constitution and empower the central authority with 2 caveats. 1, that slavery will be perpetual. That's 1 in this Confederate Constitution, and 2, that elastic clause, that necessary and proper clause that I told you was the reason for the 10th Amendment. And ultimately, the reason for the Civil War, the perception that the states didn't have authority, didn't have power, they were losing control. They had their own constitutions, they had their own ideas. And again, most states consider themselves separate and sovereign, but for their being united to the United States through that contract that was the Constitution, which was now null and void, and helping to I guess, legitimize, if you will, that sovereignty or the separation sovereignty of the states was the idea that the 10th Amendment was not being adhered to. And that's what led to the need to declare the Constitution, the contract, again, null and void. Regardless, the Republican Party's created 11 planks or so dealing with the issue of slavery. What about those other 3 planks? Well, of those other 3 planks, one of them it was clearly that the Republicans were going to stand against the spoils system. They were going to form the patronage system, right? That's in the original plan. Primarily developed in Michigan and adopted over in Philadelphia, where we get a national party that's ultimately created. And they run a candidate in 56, Fremont, who's unsuccessful in his run for president as the first Republican candidate. In 1860, the next Republican candidate, a little bit more successful than Fremont, Abraham Lincoln. But because Abraham Lincoln's elected as a Republican and the Republican platform is really weighted against slavery, that's the cue for the South to leave, right? So Lincoln's elected, the South says, see you later. And early on, and of course, in Lincoln's administration, he's faced with this secession of these states. And even in his inaugural address, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but Lincoln was saying we're not coming for the slaves. That is not the objective. We're not going to do that. Don't separate yourselves. And it was too late. They had already, South Carolina had already seceded, and the other southern states followed soon after, particularly when we started firing shots between the federal troops and the Confederate troops. But that reform plank then is part of the Republican Party. Now, after the Civil War, you have the Grant administration, probably one of the, if not the most corrupt administrations. Not that Grant himself was corrupt, but in terms of patronage, you have a lot of money changing hands after the Civil War, right? So you've got the true reconstruction of the South. I mean, the physical reconstruction of the South. You have the expansion of the railroads, right, from the far east to the far west, from California to Maine, and then you've got the Native American lands and dealing with Native Americans in this acquisition of land and the reservation system. So there's a lot of federal cash that's changing hands, and so the spoil system is ripe with graft and corruption and individuals getting money and those monies disappearing, and so the call for reform gets heightened. And as we get to the 1880 election, you have a division in the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is large and in charge. It's post-Civil War. There is still a Democrat Party. There are still Democrats. The structure is still there. The issue of slavery, at least, has been put to bed as far as the Constitution is concerned, not as far as the states are concerned per se. But you get the 13th Amendment and then, of course, the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment, which deals with voting, which really pads the Republicans' numbers because now you have newly freed slaves, black individuals. Nobody can be denied the right to vote based on the color of their skin. Their sex, yeah, but not the color of their skin. And so a number of these new voters are very beholden to the Republicans. So the Republicans are large and in charge when it comes to just post-Civil War. And so there's a rift in the Republican Party in the 1880 election regarding the reformers who want to change the patronage spoil system and those who want to keep it the way it is, right? Let's keep this party going. It's working well for us. We're in charge. To the victor goes the spoils. And the reformers choose Garfield for their presidential candidate, and the what we call the stalwarts, they choose Chester Arthur. And Garfield gets the nomination. It chooses Arthur to be his vice president, create a unity ticket. And to a degree, that may have been his demise because an imbalanced individual was, we assume, some mental troubles, came in and demanded of Garfield a specific diplomatic position that Garfield wasn't going to give him, again, reining in this idea of patronage. And Charles Guiteau, he supposedly, as the storybook goes, he brooding after this failed interview, goes into purchase a revolver, comes up, sneaks up behind Garfield in the railway station of Washington D.C.'s railway station, and then supposedly pulls out the revolver, shoots Garfield from behind, and ends up doing. He says, "I am a stalwart," and now Arthur is president. Right, the line of secession. Arthur becomes president. But Arthur doesn't slip back into this, pro-patronage, pro-spoils system mode. He adheres to the will of the party and to those elected. And again, there's got to be some indignation, right? Because ultimately Garfield dies. We know he's the second of the assassinated presidents. And in that assassination, there's got to be some hue and some cry that this is terrible. We need to do something about this. We can't allow this, particularly patronage, to go on. There has to be some good that comes out of this. And so they attempt to reform the patronage system. Now, I don't get rid of it totally, right? As we talked about in that lecture that wasn't so good in terms of squeaky voice. But as far as lecture went, the top portion, those are still appointed positions, and it's still really patronage, right? So your secretary positions, your high-level positions, all of your diplomats, your attorneys generals, your U.S. marshals, those are all appointed positions. And again, maybe certainly when it comes to those diplomatic positions and those secretary of different department positions, have a lot of patronage tied to that, right? You got to still be somebody. You got to be connected. You got to know somebody for those positions to be awarded to you. Underneath them, however, with the Civil Service Reform Act or the Pendleton Act, which comes in 1883, those individuals are now hired. They're no longer appointed. So they don't serve at the pleasure of the president, right? Whichever president or administration. They are now hired to that office, and they have some protection in that office. As long as they do their job and they're professional, they'll continue in that office. And that we call merit, right? So now we're being hired based upon what we know and not hired based upon who we know. And that's the difference in the system, and that exists even today. We have a civil service exam. You're weighted in terms of your when you apply for a job, your education, your experience. You have the interview process, and of course you have that civil service exam, which helps to legitimize your being hired for a position versus simply being appointed based upon a good little partisan. All right, I'm a good little Democrat. I'm a good little Republican, or I promise to kick back cash to you if you put me in this position. I'm not saying that doesn't still go on, right? But it's not supposed to, right? The whole reform was reform the whole system, and that extends down into the states as well. The state of Michigan has civil service requirements that go beyond just simply being appointed because of who you are. So that's where we are. That's what we basically talked about. Hit the highlights, like I said. Again, there was some other conversation there. I'm not going to go into it. 1 o'clock right here. So one of the things that we did talk about is how the structure of the executive branch and how the structure of the executive branch at the national level and at the state level are very similar. The governor's role or responsibility is also that of chief executive. And of course, we spoke just prior to COVID and the decision being made regarding removing the state Supreme Court finding unconstitutional the law that allowed the governor to carry out those executive orders regarding masks and social distancing and how many can gather and a number of other executive orders that came along with that 1945 law in her interpretation. Well, the court said that law itself was unconstitutional. And so the governor, though, if the law had been constitutional, was doing constitutional things, I would assume, but the law itself being unconstitutional negated her ability to do the executive orders and all those executive orders that existed prior. Well, governor's up here, different departments, right? The director of Michigan's Department of Health and Human Services basically reinstated every one of those, not every one, but but many of those executive orders that the governor had unconstitutionally mandated. And there's some question as to whether or not that makes sense, right? That the governor was exercising executive orders and under the law, the 1945 law, that was found to be unconstitutional because it stripped the legislature from their power. Now she's just directing, because she's the boss, the director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, to basically, through now bureaucratic edict, to reinstate those executive orders. Here's the thing. There's a law, the law that creates the director position, the department, empowers the director to do just that. So the legislature has empowered that director to be able to, particularly in situations, emergency situations, particularly pandemics or epidemics, to institute policies for the safety of the communities. And so kind of back to square one when it comes to the decisions being made regarding trying to get businesses going again, trying to come to some grips with how schools should be operating. I won't say it's a mess, but it's chaos. I mean, it's chaos in the context of COVID, right? And you guys are watching me at home on a video after I just screwed up about 54 minutes of the other one. So it's, I mean, this is par for the course. All right, so hopefully we all come together again soon. And if, like I said, I'm hopeful that as we get our numbers down here in Calhoun, we may find ourselves back in the classroom. But if not, we'll carry on this way and kind of muscle our way through it. Again, remember those lecture notes that are online, they really hit the highlights. They give you the information that we would have talked about in class. And you always have the opportunity to email me. I got about 15, 20 emails that came, looks like, of individuals saying, hey, John, this isn't coming through, fix it. And I didn't take the opportunity to stop and to check those emails as I was lecturing the last time around. So again, we'll pick it up where we left off. Again, if you want tomorrow's lecture, more detail, back to the chalkboard here, the whiteboard, drawing out the diagrams, the specifics, but what we talked about today and what you'll find in those lecture notes online, it'll cover you. All right. Okay, guys, have a good one. I'll see you on Wednesday, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me. Just kidding. Bye-bye.